Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Previous introduced me, Niken Rano. Today I will present about media stereotypes, prejudice, and preference-based reinforcement. First, background of the issue. Media such as television, online news, movies, and social media often portray certain social groups in stereotypical ways, meaning that they simplify the characteristic of those groups based on certain attributes that are often excessive or inaccurate. For example, a minority group or certain social group can be portrayed negatively, such as being portrayed as criminal or lazy. The media as one of the main sources of information for many people, this depiction has a significant impact. Information from the media is often the basis for people's understanding and attitude towards these social groups. The impact of this stereotypical portrayal can be two-way. First, it can reinforce existing negative prejudice, making the stereotypes even stronger and harder to change. Second, however, if the media present a depiction that contradicts the stereotype or counter stereotype, it can help reduce such prejudice. Therefore, understanding how media affect people prejudice is essential in the social context and psychology of communication. Next, forced exposure design constraints. Most research on the stereotypical effect of media use forced exposure design, in which participants are deliberately placed in a condition of viewing specific content. However, this approach is less reflective of the reality in today's digital media era, where audiences have complete control over the content they consume voluntarily and selectively. In forced exposure experiment, participants were forced to watch or read specific content without choice. This is a very different from the reality now, where people are free to choose content on the internet or social media. For example, people who have certain prejudice will prefer to look for news that support their beliefs. Therefore, if we only use a forced approach, we can be wrong in assessing how the media actually affect people's attitude. Next, audience selectivity affects media effect. In today's open and fragmented media environment, audiences have a high degree or freedom in choosing content. Many individuals show a tendency to seek information that aligns with their pre-existing views or beliefs. On the other hand, they tend to avoid content that contradicts or challenge those beliefs. This selectively directly affects how much the effect of the media can shape social attitude, including in terms of stereotypes and prejudice. In this day and age, we can choose media and content as we please. What happens is that people prefer to choose content that supports their own views and are uncomfortable with content that contradicts them. For example, a person who has a prejudice against a particular group will prefer news that reinforce his or her views and avoid news that defends or show the positive side of that group. So, while the media can have a big impact, the impact depends a lot on what the audience itself chooses. This is why audience selectivity is so important in the study of media effects. Next, preference-based reinforcement. Individual preference in choosing media content play an important role in shaping and reinforcing prejudice. People with prejudice tend to choose news or information that support their views, while avoiding content that challenge them. This pattern forms a cycle of reinforcement. Prejudice drives content choice and exposure to that contents further reinforce prejudice. This process shows how audience selectivity can reinforce social bias and influence the real effects of media in everyday life. In this context, we are not only talking about how influential the media is, but also how individuals actively choose content that match their beliefs. This means that even if there is positive content that can challenge stereotype, if people don't choose to see it, the effect is limited. So what happens is a vicious cycle. They have a prejudice, then they choose content that suits, then that contents reinforce, and then prejudice and keeps repeating it. This is where it is important to understand the dynamic of audience selectivity, not just the effect of the content of the media itself. Next, two patterns of selectivity: approach and avoidance. Two forms of audience selectivity, approach and avoidance, play an important role in strengthening bias. The approach occurs when an individual actively seeks out content that supports their prejudice, whereas avoidance occurs when individuals stay away from content that challenge their beliefs. Although both are separate mechanisms, they both reinforce stereotype and influence how media impacts social attitudes. In the context of media consumption, it's important to understand that people are not only looking for content that aligns with their views, but also actively avoiding information that could shake those beliefs. For example, someone who has a prejudice against a group is more likely to only watch news that reinforce his or her views and refuse to watch stories that portray the group positively. These two patterns do not always occur simultaneously and need to be studied separately because their effect on social attitude can be different. And the last conclusion. In conclusion, the influence of stereotype media on prejudice cannot be understood without paying attention to how audiences choose the content they consume. This study emphasized that media effect research must include audience selectivity factors to be more realistic. Therefore, research and practitioners are advised to use a combination of forced exposure and self-selected exposure methods to get a more accurate picture. In addition, media strategy should encourage counter-stereotypical content that challenge prejudice in order to reduce the negative effects of stereotype in society. So that's all from me. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.